Hello and welcome to History Rage, the podcast where our historians do not keep calm and there is quite a carry on. The podcast where truth rolls out the barrel on the tube while myth is carved up and sold on the black market. I am your regular host, Paul Bavill, and today we are bringing the first of two special episodes for the Imperial War Museum History Festival. And we're doing this by taking on one of the most iconic images of wartime Britain that might actually not be from wartime Britain at all. So joining me today, I am thrilled to welcome social historian and author of The Secret History of the Blitz, Joshua Levine. Joshua, welcome to your first History Rage.
Thank you, Paul. It's lovely and a little bit nerve-wracking to be here.
Feeling angry?
I am. Not necessarily about the Blitz, but yeah, generally. Yeah, I think so.
General
I'm ready.
simmering level of displeasement is always welcome on this podcast.
Yeah, it's a modern thing.
So before we kick off into what you're here to get out of your system today then, as we're promoting the Imperial War Museum Festival in June, would you kind of briefly give me what the Imperial War Museum kind of means for you?
Yeah, I will, because I've been, going there my whole life, but working there for quite a long time, because I started off doing a series of oral histories. That's how I started my career in history. And a lot of that material was taken from the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, which it's like a gold mine. It's a real treasure trove of incredible interviews, starting with the Boer War, working through to the First World War and onwards to everything since. And not just about fighting. There's a lot of social history material in there. People talking about their backgrounds, before they were soldiers, whatever they were, miners, incredible social history stories, and coming right up to the present day. And people don't really know about it at any great scale. I absolutely, I'm in awe of it, and the interviewers who carried out those interviews over the years. And so I've done a lot of work there. I've given quite a few talks there, and I also I loved it for what it, when I was younger and when I was working there, as I've worked there, for what it represents. I used to, when I was working, I'd go down, they'd kick you out at lunchtime then. And I'd go downstairs and I'd walk through the Blitz experience or the Great War Trench. And it would kind of remind me why I was doing this in the first place. These things were so atmospheric. They were so evocative, brilliantly done. And the place has absolutely been, it's a bit much to say a second home, but it's certainly somewhere I've felt very, very comfortable and comfortable with the people. So, yeah, I'm very fond of the place.
Excellent. And for all those of you out there that are just stumbling across the IWM Sound Archive for the first time, I will put a link to that in the show notes because it is a rabbit hole that you will spend weeks in. I already have. But from things that make you feel humble and proud to things that drive you absolutely bloody insane. So this is what History Rage is all about, Joshua. So today, what do you wish everybody would just stop believing?
Well, I am a big enemy of polarity, of seeing things in black and white terms, because we all live in a world, we live in a world where things happen in the gray area in between. There are very few certainties. It's all to do with perspective. It's all to do with our own prejudices. We all have prejudices. And, if I was a lawyer once upon a time, and I'd do a case, basic sort of traffic accident, and you'd have four witnesses coming forward, all telling the truth from their perspective, all giving completely different stories. That's what, and if anyone listening has a very straightforward, simple life that can be summed up in one paragraph, then, my congratulations to you, because I doubt you exist. I don't, that's not me anyway. So in terms of the Blitz was a period of time involving a huge number of people under a great deal of stress and a new kind of circumstance. So, these people being people, there is never, ever going to be one story. And people who demand a single story are clearly barking up the wrong tree. I mean, they're they don't have a sense of what human beings are. So, I mean, I can give you an example of that. So I did an article very recently, actually, for a newspaper about the other side of the Blitz, about misbehavior, about crime, about sexual behavior, about this kind of thing. And I was bending over backwards in this article to make it clear that my view was not that there's no such thing as Blitz Spirit, everyone behaved badly. Clearly. And I was, I'll talk a bit about this as, when we go on. But that was not my point. And I think I made it perfectly clear. Now, I don't normally look at comments. For some reason, I looked at the comments. And my God. Oh my God. I mean, they drive you crazy anyway. But so many people were saying, how dare he speak this way of the greatest period in British history where people came together, pulled together. How dare he suggest that any of this stuff ever happened? I mean, people actually denying that it happened, that somehow I was making this up, or denying that the period was capable of these sorts of consequences, of these sorts of events and behaviors. First of all, you don't like to be criticized, but way beyond that, what are you talking about? Have you ever met another human being? I mean, have you all only ever behaved wonderfully and gone round to your neighbors to give them a hug every day? I mean, what are you talking? So that, in a nutshell, is the thing that most drives me mad about this. But then, it's kind of a knock on. I mean, it's the same about history in general. When somebody just puts forward one viewpoint and then completely won't listen to anything else, discounts anything else. In some circumstances, I understand it. So, when you're interviewing a veteran, or when you used to interview veterans, you would sometimes suggest something somebody else had said, and that person would say, no, that never happened. I get that. If you have experienced an event in a particularly sort of pointed, emotional, vivid way, then I get you, particularly one where, you were in danger, it was that sort of edgy. I can see that you might not want to acknowledge what it was like for somebody else. But for somebody sitting behind a keyboard who wasn't there to suggest that, human beings aren't human beings.
So where do we get this kind of keep calm, carry on kind of stoicism? I mean, you see it in every bloody kind of gift shop, and anywhere that's selling a tea towel always has one of these things. To my understanding, that actually never appeared in the war. Where's it bloody come from?
The keep calm and carry on. No. The phrase, the poster, I mean, it was printed up. And I think something like 2.5 million copies of it did exist, but they were never released. They were never put up. I think the occasional one got out. So I saw somewhere a Cecil Beaton photograph where there was one in the background. So it's not like they never ever, but I mean, very, very few of them. And that poster, I mean, that basically came out and that was written up because it was going to be used if things got very, very bad, if things got very, very severe. So they had a couple of others that came out first and that actually did come out, the printed at the same time. One was Freedom is in Peril. And that poster actually did go up, and it wasn't popular because it sounded a bit sort of too intellectual, and it wasn't really clear what it was saying. There was another, Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will prevail or bring us victory or something. Bring us victory. And that one wasn't liked because it was incredibly patronizing. It was, your courage, your cheerfulness, you ordinary people will bring us victory. So in other words, we're the elite, and we're telling you what to do. And if you do that, then we'll take the credit. That's almost what it's saying. Keep calm and carry on was meant for the sort of, deep crisis or disaster when a situation got out of hand. But I think also, and that didn't quite happen. I mean, it was a terrible period, but it didn't get to that stage. But also, I think there's an element of the patronizing there as well. Keep calm and carry on. Just, I'll tell you how to behave. And I don't think people in general, but British people particularly, like being told how to behave. Or
least of all by the government.
Least of all by the government. I mean, they people will respond if the government is clever about it. If the propaganda becomes more subtle, which in a lot of films, we can talk about that, but in a lot of films of the period, the films like the Bells Go Down and Fires Were Started, which are films about the fire service, really the auxiliary fire service during the war. And they were quite clever films because, the Bells Go Down had Tommy Trinder, who was incredibly popular. It also had a young James Mason. And, Tommy Trinder was this auxiliary fireman, no experience, arrived on the scene, was hopeless, inexperienced, didn't know what on earth, he was playing Tommy Trinder. And over the course of the film, he improved, he became competent, and became sort of inadvertently a hero. And the same with Fires Were Started, which was another film about the fire service, but actually using real firemen who had served, who had been at the Blitz. And again, it shows a certain amount of the real, the terror, the fear, the difficulty, the danger. But then kind of at the end, people go through hell and, manage to deal with it. So it's an arc. Both films are an arc, but they're great entertainment. And they also show enough of the reality that people were willing to, to watch them, enjoy them, and take the message out at the same time. So, so propaganda was absolutely, work during the war. The consensus, the government wanted people to behave in a certain way. They wanted to encourage that. So the propaganda was at play. I mean, look at the newspapers. Pictures were censored, things were pulled out. There's that famous picture of the milkman walking across the rubble, which in fact he wasn't a milkman at all. It was a posed picture. The newspapers weren't allowed to name the places where raids had taken place. So you had this ridiculous sort of in a northern town, sort of stuff like that.
I remember that classic photograph of the bombed out building with the secretary still typing away on the desk outside. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That is Blitz Spirit stuff.
That is Blitz Spirit. And, if you look at the music of the time, all pulled together, and no extra charge for the performance. There is this idea, I suppose what Blitz Spirit essentially is people singing Roll Out the Barrel in communal shelters and shaking their fists at the sky as, bloody Adolf as the Heinkels go over and then dodging the debris the next morning like that famous supposed milkman. And, are we downhearted? No. And all this kind of thing. See, this is what the government did want to promote. It became the consensus, the idea that people don't panic and didn't panic and behaved, that there was no crime, that there was no misbehavior. Everybody behaved a certain way. Although, interestingly, I think there is one little bit, there are a few bits of misbehavior that was sort of allowed into the consensus. And fiddling the rations is one. That's okay. Private Walker in Dad's Army. That's kind of a bit of that's a British trait. We try and get away with a bit more. So that's okay. Even though where did that stuff come from? Probably from a smash and grab raid that had then, it had been sold to a middleman who then sold it on to Private Walker. But you don't see that in Dad's Army.
I think actually this would be a good point. I was going to come to this later, but I'll dive into this now since we raised that, is that if you go to any kind of 1940s event, which some of them are very educational, some of them are very rose-tinted nostalgia fests, they are what they are. But you'll almost invariably see like a spiv-style chap wandering around with a briefcase that's got some stockings in it and so forth. And it's never really sat right with me. These people are absolute gangsters, aren't they? I mean, what is the reality of the wartime spiv?
I think when it was just a sort of, a local person who knew how to get a bit extra. I mean, lots of people were on the fiddle. Probably more wealthy people knew how to get hold of stuff. But, I found an account from a man whose wife was working in a restaurant. She most nights would bring home, a piece of chicken or a piece of steak in her knickers. People had their ways, and whether you'd want to eat it after that, I don't know. But so people had their ways. But the spivs were at one end of the huge increase in crime that took place at this time. They some of them might have been cheeky chappies, but they were cheeky chappies who were taking advantage of some pretty brutal stuff at the other end. So, it's again, nothing straightforward, nothing simple. It's a complex story of real people behaving like real people. And, so this is the idea, this is the sort of government idea of what Blitz Spirit was, which of course, we have invoked every 20 minutes since then. We can come on to that. But I don't think in its essence, Blitz Spirit was untrue, because if you look at how people really did, well, I've got a great story. I spoke to this woman called Joan Varley, lovely woman. She was, old when I spoke to her, and she'd had a very interesting life. She'd worked for the Conservative Party for many years. In the 1950s, she was responsible for finding female candidates for Parliament. So I'll give you 10 guesses as to who she found in the 1950s. Write in on a postcard, viewers. You'll win something that Paul will suggest.
Win Joshua singing again.
Yeah, exactly. Well, an afternoon of me at your house. But she was on a bus, so she was upstairs on a bus going through Westminster, and it was her at the back smoking. Good old days, smoke at the back, and there was a stranger man at the front. Only two people up there, and they heard a bomb coming down, or a stick of bombs coming down, and they heard them. And the bus driver obviously heard them as well, because he veered off the route. And then when they'd exploded, he came back onto the route. But while they heard them coming down, and while he was veering off, the man at the front stood up, walked to the back, sat next to her, held her hand, and when the bombs exploded, he got up again and walked back. They never exchanged a word or a glance. Now that's Blitz Spirit. That is people coming together in shared danger in a way that they never would have come together otherwise. And that's a tiny little moment. But, multiply that. And you have people together. You have people sharing all kinds of things, people volunteering together, feeling they ought to volunteer. And so people from all walks of life coming together. And take it to its extreme. I mean, for me, this period is the first sexual revolution. You have people coming together on the bus and people coming together elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it was, it absolutely was a time, a brief time, when people did, they really did have things in common, or something in common, and then as an extension, other things in common, the way they were living, same clothes, same food, sheltering together, evacuation, all kinds of things that were happening, working together in factory, all kinds of things that were happening that were bringing people together. So at that, it was, I think it was real. And which isn't to say that it was even everybody or even widespread. I mean, I found a badge saying, I'm not interested in your bomb. Someone wore that. So they just didn't want someone coming over. And there was this idea, people would get together and they'd have a kind of boasting session about, oh, wait till you hear what happened to me. There was a kind of one-upmanship about the whole thing. I think also it was when people came together, it was because of the shared danger and everything else. It was also a kind of instinctive realization that life actually mattered. People were sort of brought down to the bare bones of what their existence meant. And also, it was necessity. People had to carry on. People had harder lives even before the war. And, coming out of the Depression, people had hard lives and they were used to carrying on. And this was harder still. But they were used to carrying on. They were used to having to keep going, both at a personal level and being aware of having to do it at a national level as well. So it wasn't all, state-induced or state imposed, but it was to a great degree. I mean, London can take it. That's a straight propaganda film. And part of it's for America as well, bear in mind. You've got a situation here where, the British need the Americans to come into the war, or certainly to help out financially in terms of supplies. And so Britain had to show the Americans, you had Ed Murrow, who was the great American broadcaster who was in London at the time, broadcasting back. And so, Britain had to show the Americans that they were worth backing. They could survive.
Yeah, that we weren't
so
going to
this
be
whole
beaten.
idea, but they couldn't at the same time show them. They couldn't show things too awful, because then the Americans wouldn't want to support them. They couldn't show things too good either, because the Americans would think, well, they don't really need our help. So there's a really delicate balance of what the Ministry of Information was working out we ought to show the Americans. So, there's a lot of things at play here that are going on. It's not straightforward. But I mean, the consensus, my God, it grew and it grew over the years. I found a really interesting, there was an article, I think it was a letter in the Times, but basically in November 40, I think it was Mass Observation, sent an investigator to Coventry. And they were there basically when, there's a massive November attack on Coventry as the Blitz widened out, beyond London, because the Blitz, we've got to remember, was across the country, across the United Kingdom, Belfast. A couple of bombs were accidentally dropped on Dublin. But they sent somebody into Coventry, and this person reported a kind of shock, kind of helplessness, people coming out saying, Coventry is dead, and reporting this terrible panic as people came out. And then this was published in I think it was a Times newspaper in 1972. And that got letters in, Coventry never wavered. This is all lies. And of course, what this report was not saying Coventry wavered. It was saying people came out of shelters in a state of shock. That's all it's saying. It's saying they came out to their astonishment, to find their city absolutely leveled. But the consensus had taken hold, and they weren't allowed to say. I mean, you can see the same with other things around the world. 9/11. I mean, these events build up a consensus, and you're not allowed to question it. And that makes me very, very cross. I don't know if I sound cross enough, but I mean,
You're getting there.
It's a complete misreading of humanity and a total lack of nuance. I mean, and of course, all kinds of bad behavior came out of the Blitz. I mean, astonishingly bad behavior.
Well, let's dig into a bit of that bad behaviour then. What is going on? I mean, we have done an episode previously with Mark Ellis, who touched on the Blackout Ripper, so I've got that one covered. Right. But we tended to focus on
alone.
Kind of.
He was not. Alone. Well, he was the only mass murderer that I know of. But only serial killer, but there was a lot of crime during. I mean, there's not, another. God, too many thoughts. I mean, one quite well-known murder at the time, which actually managed to knock El Alamein off the front page for a day, was the kind of murder that must have happened a lot, but we don't know. Somebody using the Blitz as a way of killing somebody and making them look as though they were a bombing victim. And the reason we know about this one, it was a man who killed his wife, and basically he was a fire watcher. He really didn't get on with his wife, and she didn't get on with him. And he killed her, and he was a fire watcher, and he was there when a building came down, and he killed her and put her body underneath a concrete slab in a way that the bomb couldn't have done. She was found in a position. She was only found a year later. So she disappeared. No one knew what had happened. She was found a year later and identified by very, very early dental records. And he was tried, and he was convicted, and he was hanged. But he can't have been alone in doing that. I mean, it was the perfect opportunity to do away with someone that you couldn't stand. But by extension, it was a perfect opportunity to do all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
You had, I mean, the Blackout Ripper tells its own story. I mean, you had darkness, you had no lights, you had houses that had been blown open, so things were around. You had fewer police because most of the police had been called up, and you had specials who'd been called out of retirement and this kind of thing. It was, a paradise for criminals, and crime went up. The 1941 figures were considerably higher than the 1939 figures, and I've got, so many stories of this. So many stories of looting, some firemen who had arrived at St. Paul's and found a bomb had hit a building opposite, helped themselves to things from that building, from a warehouse and from an off license, and they were sent to prison. A mass observation person went into a demolition squad, and he said that they just take everything, absolutely everything. He said, they came across a wallet, and the leader of the demolition squad said, "Oh, this is funny. Look, the bomb has blown all the cash out, and all the, that's just how it was." I'm not saying for every demolition squad, but, in that particular squad. And my favorite story is, which I think represents so much, and represents, actually, I haven't quite got to it yet, what this period was really all about. It's a man, a career criminal called Wally Thompson. And he had a criminal gang, and they used the Blitz as cover for their activity. What they would do is they'd go out, they'd steal a van, and they'd wait for a raid. They'd dress up in ARP costumes, so they would attract no suspicion whatsoever. They would already have staked out a place where there was a safe, and they would go along during a raid when nobody was around. At their leisure, they would, manhandle the safe into their van, and they would take it back to somewhere where they could open it again at their leisure. So this is what they did. They took advantage, like many criminals did, of the raid and of the bombing. Now, on one particular occasion, a bomb landed nearby while they were manhandling the safe out of a warehouse in London Bridge. And the bomb blew them into the air, blew the safe into the air. They were all okay, and they decided, let's leave this one, and they started to make their way back to their van. As they did so, one of them saw a child in a third floor window, and the building was on fire. So this particular man, whose name was Spider, because he was like a cat burglar, he could scale walls, up he went. And he went up the drain pipe. He got her in his arms, and he was trying to bring her down when a fire engine arrived with a policeman. They used to send police to what they called incidents. And it sent up its ladder. It helped them down, brought them down. And then, bear in mind, the safe was still there. And the policeman said to Spider, "This is wonderful what you've done. You saved her life. Can I take your name and address, your details to recommend you for an award?" Now, Spider was already known to the police, had no desire to give any more details. No, he said, no, off they went. But the point of this story is that this was a time of incredible intensity, you know? And you could go from stealing a safe to saving a life in the, like that, in the flash of a bomb. The same person could do a terrible thing and a wonderful thing within seconds of each other. And that, to me, is where Blitz Spirit comes from and where the bad behavior comes from. This is a period of incredible intensity that knocked people out of their rhythms. You know how we mostly go about life on a sort of conveyor belt. We do what we do. And this, the war, and particularly this period for people who were under the bombs, were knocked off their conveyor belt. They suddenly saw that they could do things, they could live lives that they'd never considered living before. So they were brought together in ways they would never have imagined. They were people they never had anything in common with. And that included people of different classes. There's a limit to how far you want to take that argument, but there's no doubt people of different classes were brought together, and a certain empathy did develop. I mean, after this period, a lot of it just dissipated once the bombs had stopped. But at this period, and for some afterwards as well, there was a coming together of different peoples, different kinds of people. But at the same time, it also made people realize, I can do I don't have to be good necessarily. I can take advantage of circumstances where they present themselves. So, looting was in theory punishable by death. I mean, nobody was, but people were sent to prison. Those firemen were sent to prison. And you couldn't, looting meant taking half a bottle of vodka from, a bombed out building, even though, or a paperback book, even though it was going to be thrown away anyway. I mean, this was recycling, really. Go to prison for recycling. But, there was opportunity absolutely everywhere. And again, and people took advantage of it. And people were jerked out of their rhythms. They tried things they'd never tried before. They lived lives they'd never lived before. They took opportunities they hadn't. And the same goes for sex. This is why I talk about the first sexual revolution. It was a time when there's a diary of a girl who's 18, and in it she says, I'm paraphrasing it, but I may be dead tomorrow. I'm going to sleep with Rupert. I'm not paraphrasing the name. His name was Rupert. And then the following day, or a couple of days later, she writes, "If that's all there is to it, I'd rather have had a good smoke." So Rupert gets a very poor review. But
yeah, so that's a one-star review there, isn't it?
That's really a one-star review. Don't read beneath, don't read the comments. Just get on with your life. But, there it is. I mean, there it couldn't be starker. I might be dead tomorrow, so I'm going to try this. In all kinds of ways. So there was, I spoke to a woman who's talked about her mother, and her mother was living in London, and her husband was away fighting. He was in North Africa. And she was never a particularly happy person. But during the war, a man came down from Scotland to work in one of the ministries, leaving his family back up there. And the two of them started, you couldn't really call it an affair. It was a wartime marriage. They were completely loyal to each other. They were as though they were married, but on the understanding that the day it was over, it was finished. They would never see each other again. So it was a kind of, it was a wartime convenience. It was for the duration. It was the wartime. It was a sexual equivalent of powdered egg. It was something that was only going to last while this was going on. And she said her mother was as happy as she had ever been. So, in so many different ways, people expanded their horizons. They did things they would never have done before. And I don't know this is true. It's my silly theory, but I wonder if the play in the film Brief Encounter, the Noel Coward, may be about something like this, because you have this, they never do anything, but you have this infatuation between these two people. And at the end, she goes back to her husband and he says, "Thank you for coming back to me." He knows what's been happening, turns out. And it's kind of a parallel to what, people were behaving in extraordinary ways during the war, but now it's over. Draw a line under that. And, it was homosexuality, another one. I mean, Quentin Crisp is fascinating on it. He calls London a great paved double bed. He tells all these incredible stories about how things changed, about, he was on the bus one day, a lot seems to happen on the bus, and he was driving along and he felt something in his hair, very long, unusual hair. And he felt something in his hair. And he said there was a huge Australian soldier with a comb out, just gently combing his hair in the seat behind. And he came up on a charge of soliciting, I suppose it was, which he did quite often and always was convicted. And he said the clerk of the court started to humiliate him, as he always did. I suppose you consider yourself a male of the species. It was all that kind of stuff. Trying to humiliate him. And he said he was acquitted. He said he never imagined he would be acquitted of this offence. He said there was a complete change in attitudes. Again, people trying what they never ordinarily would have tried. And of course, after the war, bang, all slammed down. It was the Marriage Guidance Council was brought about to put a lid on the sort of behaviour that had been going on, to put women back into dresses, to get women out of the workplaces, out of the factories where they had no business. Now, their usefulness is up. Back into the home now that the men have come back from war. And the same with homosexuality, really stamping down on it. And so, to me, this is the first sexual revolution that led, in some ways, to the second, because you had this reaction against it, and then the 60s was a reaction against that. But anyway, the point being, which I think I was making about 20 minutes ago, was that the intensity of this period really jerked people out of their rhythms, and was responsible for the good and was responsible for the bad, and it was kind of all one. So if you want your Blitz Spirit, there's the broad brush.
In all the sides. So we've mentioned quite a few of the mass observation reports that are coming here. And we've also kind of mentioned that there is an element of this Blitz Spirit that is not so much state mandated, but very much state assisted via all the propaganda of what their message that they want to go out. What do we know about kind of actual public morale through the Blitz? Because the whole point of the Blitz is to break British morale.
Yes.
Where do we see the good and the bad in that?
You'll be surprised to hear me say that it was across the board. People behaved like people, in intense situations. People don't behave the same way. And, the authorities definitely did fear panic. And, they were very, very aware. I mean, hence the posters. They were very aware that panic could emerge. I mean, as you say, that was one of the big aims was to sort of foment public
and you only have to
discontent.
look at Bethnal Green tube station to see what it can do.
Exactly. Bethnal Green is slightly later, 43, but it's a very good example. It's the classic, actually. Supposedly a new type of anti-aircraft gun was being used, and people weren't used to the sound. As I know it, I'm sure there'll be people who might have a different story, but and people panicked and started a stampede inside the tube station. Lots of people were killed, and of course the Jews were blamed. Plus ça change. And it's an interesting one because it's a very sort of, it's one you can absolutely pinpoint where panic did take over. And, the government was very scared of this happening. So what the government wanted initially, they didn't want people sheltering together, in large numbers. They wanted people to be dispersed. So hence the Anderson shelters in people's gardens, or the refuge rooms, the sort of strengthened rooms in people's cellars.
The Morrison shelter.
And then the Morrison, which was brought in actually, I think it was March 41, because there was a recognition that a lot of people were taking shelter under the dining room table. And Morrisons were very strong, but I wouldn't like to have been dug out if my house had collapsed, on top of one. So this idea that communal deep shelters, well, partly they were very expensive, but partly also the government actually genuinely believed that a sort of society of troglodytes, of moles, anti-establishment people who would offer nothing to society, would kind of build up in the deep. The unknown people, literally a subclass, would develop who beyond control. They also feared contagious disease and contagious fear as well. And there was the cost. So they didn't want this. And it also meant they didn't want people sheltering in the tubes. And so there was no law against sheltering in the tubes, and people had done it in the First World War. But the government was very, very against it and tried to keep people out. And to the point where I found a cabinet meeting minutes where it was being discussed, what do we do about it? Do we send armed troops in? And, I think it was the head of the Metropolitan Police said, absolutely not. We don't, that's doing Hitler's work for him if we start firing at our own people trying to take shelter. So that was never done. Started with Liverpool Street on the 8th of September. And then I think Holborn a couple of days, 2 or 3 days later, people forced their way in. And it became a fait accompli. Government may not have wanted them there, but down they went. And you did have a certain amount of anti-establishment. You had a group of mainly communists from Stepney who forced their way into the Savoy shelter as a kind of protest that the tubes weren't open. And they did it, they insisted on, they ordered tea and insisted on paying the amount for tea that they would pay at a Lions Corner house. It was really a publicity stunt. It wasn't meant to be aggressive. But, there was a certain amount there was quite a lot of discontent going on, that people weren't being protected. And there was more discontent in certain places. There were certain cities around the country and towns that felt they were not the priority.
Yeah. Such as?
Liverpool was one. I think Glasgow was probably another. Now, I don't want lots of people getting in touch saying, this is unfair to single out Liverpool and Glasgow. It is unfair to single out Liverpool and Glasgow. Those are just two where I happen to have found, accounts. So I'm absolutely not saying that these were hotbeds of discontent. They were simply examples of places where there was a certain amount, because, for quite understandable reasons, because they felt they were being overlooked. They felt also, in areas of, poor, think about it. Why were these places being heavily bombed, and the East End of London and Coventry? Because, they had the factories. Some of them had the ports. These were areas of industry. And who lived in areas of industry? The poor lived in areas of industry. So they were much more likely to be targeted, and they were much more likely to have shelter that was not sufficient. Lots of people who didn't have their own shelters had to go to these surface shelters. And a lot of them were very badly built. There was a scandal over the fact that they had been built with very poor cement, and they collapsed very easily. And those that did collapse, with people in them, the result became very darkly known as a Morrison sandwich, after the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison. So there was a lot of discontent around. Now, the government was worried always that morale would. Another way of looking at it, the bombing was around the East End at first, and it wasn't further west, where the wealthier people lived. For example, the King and Queen at Buckingham Palace. And then just a few days into the war, Buckingham Palace got a bomb. Actually got a couple. And this bomb went off in what's called the quadrangle. I never really know what that means. It's, the square. blew in, I think it blew in windows, and they were there at the time. And the king apparently had a sort of shell shock, PTSD, for a while afterwards. But it was after that that the Queen, later the Queen Mother, was able to say, I can look the East End in the face. And it was absolutely, I mean, I think they were probably pleased that the bomb had dropped, because it was a levelling up. It wasn't just the poor people who were getting it and the rich weren't. If the king and queen can get it, then we are really all in this together. So, there was discontent. I don't think it was, discontent about the war. I think people basically understood what the war was, and the war, it wasn't a war like the First World War where, people were lining up to do their bit. It was much more, this is what we have to do, unfortunately. This is the situation. And people basically understood that.
It's the
So they
first
weren't,
war I think we fight as well where it really comes to the home front. I mean, you get it in the First World War with the shelling of Scarborough and Zeppelin raids, but it's like, this is really coming to our front door at this point.
They're frontline, people are frontline soldiers. And I think, that's an interesting idea as well, because that sort of increased the importance of the people. The people became really necessary to the government in a way that they really hadn't quite been ever in the past. They were frontline soldiers, so their morale needed to be upheld. They were working in the factories. They were fighting. They were volunteering. They were the war simply, whereas in the past, an expeditionary force could be sent abroad and the war could be fought. Wasn't like that this time. The people were fighting it. The people were maintaining it and were suffering in a way they never had before. So it absolutely was in the government's interest to treat them better than they ever had before. This is why wages in factories went up. This is why all kinds of concessions were made to the people during the war. The Labour ministers who were in charge of the home front kind of set up a proto-welfare state at this point. And this is, I really do think at this point is a kind of crucible where the relationship between the government and its people changed, and it couldn't go back after the war. It was absolutely a crucible moment. And I've found this extraordinary story. People don't know this. In what a real measure of how people were suffering, and I suppose discontent as well. The bombing in September and October of London was brutal. What the government had imagined in advance was that huge numbers of people would be killed. The figures, extraordinary figures put out in 1938 of, millions of people killed within months of the war starting. But they hadn't anticipated that relatively, a lot of people were killed, 43,500 over the course of the Blitz, but relatively fewer than were expected. What they hadn't anticipated was the amount of homelessness. People would just be left completely helpless. They'd be left with no money, nowhere to go, without clothes, without food, and absolutely no idea how to get hold of any of this.
Mm-hmm.
And they simply weren't prepared for it. And I found this extraordinary story. A woman called Ida Rodway, who was married. She was in her 60s. Her husband was in his 70s. He was a retired sort of carried carman. And he was starting to become senile. And they were bombed out of their house in Stepney. You could spend a night or two in a rest centre, but basically there was nothing else. There were lots of different places you had to go for help, for all sorts of different things. And you were treated like a Victorian beggar. There was still the idea that if you were poor, it was morally your fault, and that if you needed things, then, you had to be grateful and you had to be treated as though you were some kind of morally reprehensible individual. And that even went for these people who, How could they possibly help their situation? But still they were being treated, having to justify themselves as though, a bomb fell on me. That's why I'm here. So Ida Rodway and her husband had been bombed out of their house and they had nowhere to go. They ended up sleeping on her sister's floor and they were there for a while. And she could see that her husband had no idea what was going on. He was becoming more and more distressed. She was hopeless. They had nothing. She didn't know where to go for anything. She had absolutely no hope whatsoever. And so she decided to take her own life. And then she thought, no, that's not fair on him. That's just leaving him. So one morning she went to get his morning cup of tea and she came back instead with a knife and she slit his throat and she killed him. And then she ran outside and she found a policeman. She said, I've killed my husband. Now, she was put on trial at the Old Bailey. And this was a murder, clearly. And the penalty for murder was death. And equally clearly, this was a mercy killing. So what you had, I've been through the papers in the National Archive, and what you have is the doctor, basically, the Old Bailey doctor, basically bending over backwards to find her guilty but insane. Because then her life would be spared, she'd be sent to a mental hospital. And that's what happened. And she was sent to Broadmoor. Women were women then. And she lived her life out. She died, I think, in 46 in Broadmoor. But it's perfectly clear from looking at the papers, she's not insane at all. She's desperate. I mean, desperate beyond words and beyond belief, but she's doing the only thing that makes sense to her in the circumstances. She's the opposite of insane. And, that's an unknown story. It's not as though that story led to the change. But what the government did was to bring in what you now call a czar, somebody who basically dealt with what was being known by some at the time as the crisis of London. And he just turned things round. This was in October 40. It's all happened so quickly. This all happened incredibly quickly. It happened in less than a few weeks. Amazing how quick it was. So this man was brought in, and his job basically was to create order out of chaos. And so he did all these different measures. So, first of all, made housing available because there was virtually no housing available for people to be moved back into. He managed to get housing available. Repairs. So people who were off to join the army were turned around and brought back and put on duty, carrying out repairs on houses. He had sort of centres, like one-stop shops, where instead of people having to go to 7 or 8 different places for all their needs, they could go to one place and they could have everything taken care of in one place. And he got rid of that sort of poor law stigma. You weren't treated as though you were begging for gin. You were treated as though you were another person who was a victim of Hitler's bombing. And there was nothing you could have done about it. He brought in social workers to deal with individual cases. I mean, this was a total revolution, again, in the attitude of the government towards its people. And again, it's a kind of, I'm not saying it led to the welfare state, but it's a proto-welfare state.
Well,
at a
when
time
you
when
see
we
it
don't
work,
think of this.
You're gonna post-war, there's going to be a lot of people, particularly on the Labour side of that government, that have seen that work and go, right now, I know we can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were a lot of
set that in
soldiers coming
process.
home. There were soldiers coming home who, people remembered the First World War. A land fit for heroes, and it hadn't. Nothing had happened. Things had not changed. A bit of council housing, things had not changed, and led to the Depression. And people, even non-political people. I mean, I think it's wrong to say that soldiers serving were all rabidly political. They weren't, but there was definitely a groundswell. We want it better now. We've been through a lot, and these were soldiers serving came back. This is why it was a landslide election. It wasn't a vote of no confidence in Winston Churchill. It wasn't a comment on, people were incredibly grateful to him, but they wanted a new way of living. They wanted a new relationship with the government, with the state. They just wanted a safety net. They wanted protections. They wanted a better world than the one they remembered before the war. And this was kind of the crucible of it, I think. So again, this is not a simple period. This is a period where so much is going on below the surface. We haven't talked about the bomb. I mean, you know,
I don't think we're going to have time to either.
Or the bomb disposal men, who are, my heroes, about short of being an agent in France, or maybe a member of a bomber crew. I mean, I can't think of anything more dangerous than being bomb disposal, because these men. The father of a friend of mine was Royal Engineers bomb disposal. Went out in 1940. Never seen a German bomb when he dealt with the first one. There was an expression they used. Join the army, see the world. Join bomb disposal, see the next world. That's how. They were. It was a game of cat and mouse. I don't know what I'm talking about. This just fascinates me. Sorry, ask your next question.
So to round us off then, because that has been an absolute roller coaster on all sides. Say, to round us off, what is the one message you'd like everybody listening this to take away when anybody sees the Keep Calm and Carry On tea towel, or just hears about this idea of Blitz Spirit? What would you like them to take away?
Be aware of nuance in life, and in this instance, in relation to this period, because it's a much, much more interesting period than many people think it is. It's a crucible for social change. It's a point where people individually started to think differently about themselves, about each other, about their own lives, about what they were capable of doing, in good ways, bad ways, or ways. Why even talk about it as good and bad? In ways. And just be open to things that you wouldn't, don't necessarily polarize on this subject or on any subject.
Well, thank you very much. Do you feel better for having got that out of your system?
Not really. Yes, I do. I think it's very important. I mean, I do genuinely think it's important. So much of what we write, and it's possible when you're working in history to become so sort of consumed by it that you can't see the bigger picture. And I think it's important to always keep an eye on the bigger picture. So it is satisfying to be able to talk about this, and also feel free to disagree. That's the other thing. You may think I'm talking a load of rubbish, and so put comments up, and I won't read them.
Well, thank you very much, Joshua.
Thank you.
Well, if you would like to know more about Joshua's work, then you can and should start by buying a ticket to the IWM History Festival. Joshua will be speaking on Saturday, the 13th of June, and you can get tickets at iwm.org.uk. You can buy the book, The Secret History of the Blitz, and I will place a link in the show notes where you can purchase that. And that will help out both this podcast and an independent bookshop. If you would like to hear more on Blitz Britain, then check out episode 256 with Mark Ellis raging about wartime crime, or episode 205 where Nathan Hazelhurst rages that there is more to civil defence than putting lights out. I do hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you would like to support the show, then you can join up as a History Rager on Patreon. £5 per month will get you entry into the monthly book draw, the invite to put questions as part of our monthly live stream, and of course, the coveted History Rage mug. But until then, thank you very much for listening, and until next week, stay angry. Bye-bye.